What's shaking booktube? My name's Cam and welcome back to another video. In case you weren't prepared, just as a warning, this video is going to be a bit steamy. Sorry, I'm still a bit sick. This video is the very first in a new writing mini-series I want to do called On Writing. After like more than a year, I think I'm finally finished with the writing cliches to avoid videos, so we're moving on to something new now. And the difference with the On Writing series is that I intend for it to be more like a casual conversation about whatever topic it is that that video is about. For example, today, romance. Rather than all of my other writing tip videos where it was me just quite literally giving you a list of do's and don'ts, this one is more of just a conversation. So today's video is romance, and that's not necessarily romance books, but romance in books. And I don't want to brag or anything, but I'm somewhat of a love expert. Something that I've come to learn about romance that I think is just objectively true is that romance is perhaps the most sought out element of any kind of story. And I mean, that can be seen by quite literally every bestseller list out there. Romance just absolutely and cataclysmically dominates every single statistic in terms of what is the most popular genre of book to purchase nowadays. But although romance is the most sought out element of a story, I've also found that it tends to be the most criticized. And I think the reason that romance feels like it's criticized so much more than any other element of a story is because it's so prevalent in every single genre. I suppose that's the good news for people that actively seek out romance stories and enjoy coming across romance subplots in other genres of fiction, for example, fantasy or mystery, even horror tends to include a romance in there at some point to raise the stakes. I think the topic of romance in books and actually in movies and music and television, romance everywhere seems to actually transcend genre. It seems to be a staple. It's just almost necessary now for any kind of fictional narrative. When we're reading a book or watching a TV show or watching a movie and we see two characters that happen to be of the group that the other character is attracted to sexually or romantically, almost immediately if we're introduced to two, or I guess more if it's a polyamorous story, but if we're introduced to, let's just say, two characters and the narrative takes any kind of time to put some real importance on both of those characters, we'll assume that they will at some point have a romantic subplot. The reason I say that I feel like nowadays romance transcends even being a genre is because it's not just a subplot of any other kind of genre of story. It tends to be the subplot. There has to be a romantic subplot nowadays for the story to feel complete. Now, I won't say that people don't want to read stories about the most attractive character getting with the other most attractive character, or the most attractive character getting with the nerdy plain character, because people do tend to enjoy those stories, be it solely just because it's wish fulfillment, to be honest. And that's okay, actually. I mean, wish fulfillment in stories is something that's just inherently approached as being a negative thing. I tend to disagree. I mean, in fact, at the end of the day, isn't that kind of the whole point of fiction, is to provide some kind of escapism? And if you're going to provide an escapism, why not make it wish fulfillment? But obviously, that's not always preferable, because the problem with wish fulfillment is that it's not as relatable. And when something is more relatable, it's more compelling. So, I mean, it's a really easy writing tip to say, don't create an insta-love between the handsome jock and the nerdy plain girl, because, I mean, well, that's a cliche, obviously. But saying not to do that has become a cliche in itself. It's pretty common knowledge nowadays. I think to go into it a bit further, to kind of dive a bit deeper into that writing tip, I think the best way to put it would be that a romantic story or a romantic subplot is a lot more compelling and a lot more emotional for the reader if it's somewhat relatable. And it's also a lot more immersive if the attraction is earned, rather than just seeing an attractive person out. And I mean, that can happen in the story, because here's a hard pill to swallow. Physical attraction is important, and that's okay. Everyone deserves to be with someone that is physically attracted to them. If you're not physically attracted to someone, that's okay. Leave them for someone else who will be. So having the characters being physically attracted to each other is important for the story, I think, if you are to have a genuine romance. But the romance can't just be the physical attraction. The attraction has to be earned, and it has to be on a more emotional level, because that's what's important to everyone. I mean, it sounds like a duh moment, but like, whether people realize it or not, when they're in a relationship, the thing they value most about the person that they're in love with is all of the little quirks and all of the little complementary traits that they have between each other. When someone breaks up after a long relationship, they're not really comforted by seeing other people who are just as attractive as the person they just broke up with. And the reason for that is because what they're upset about isn't that they don't get to be with this attractive person anymore. It's because they don't get to share this genuine romantic friendship with a person that was in their life for so long. Anyway, to summarize basically everything I just said just then, romance has to be earned. That's a point of, including it in the story. That's a point of having a romantic subplot, because you want to go on a bit of a journey with these characters and see how that relationship how it's come to exist and how it's come to develop. I think something that I've found significantly more difficult to write, and I imagine a lot of other writers have as well, is writing characters that are in a relationship versus characters who are building up to one. And I think the explanation for that's pretty easy, and that's just that the chase is always more exciting, and not just for the people involved or the characters involved, but for the reader. I think that's especially true for the reader, or the voyeur. And yeah, I mean that in the creepiest way possible, in the most Norman Bates way possible, I mean that. I think one thing that's important to remember when you're writing characters going from in the chase stage of the relationship to being in the actual relationship itself is that a relationship, like a character, needs to have an arc. The relationship is almost a character in itself, in that it needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. And of course, there's going to be a lot of little ups and downs along the way, but generally you want it to build up to a climax and then come to a resolution. One issue I always seem to notice really quickly in terms of, mostly you'll find it in movies and television, obviously, because they're working with a bit of a limited time frame, but it does happen in books as well, and that is that they have this character who is pretty developed, they have their own personality, and they have flaws, and as soon as they're introduced to the one or the significant other, they're just a completely different person. They're magically a better version of themselves. And I mean, that's the dream, right? That's what everyone wants, and that's kind of what we've been raised to expect, is that when we meet the perfect person, we'll feel like a completely different person around them. But the truth of the matter is that that's just almost never an immediate thing. I mean, we'll tend to act a bit different around people that we're trying to impress, but that's different. That's not what I'm talking about here. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we don't want to see a character become a better person immediately upon meeting their significant other. We want to see them become a better person. We want to see them develop. That's the point of their character arc, is that the other person is helping them to become a better person. I think that's the best way to write a compelling romantic story or compelling romantic subplot, is to, like I said before, create a bit of an arc for the relationship and also an arc for the characters in the relationship. We want to see how the significant other is actually helping them to become a better person. We don't just want to see them have a bit of banter and all of a sudden everything's bright and merry, On that topic, another thing I've noticed is that some characters will be given flaws. For example, they're petty or they're kind of spiteful, and as soon as they're introduced to the significant other, those flaws or those traits suddenly don't exist anymore. Although they wouldn't tend to be there in the beginning, because obviously they're trying to impress the other person. Once the relationship develops a bit more, we want to see those flaws bleed into the relationship. We want to see them being a bit petty with the other person. We want to see them being a bit spiteful, because that's the whole point. It's those flaws from both of the characters that would create a bit of conflict for the characters. Because one of the biggest mistakes that new writers make when they write romance, perhaps the biggest mistake, is that they forget romance needs conflict. And that doesn't always have to be their relationship is at stake crisis, or the fate of the world is at stake crisis. It can be something like one of the characters is being a bit petty. Obviously, you don't want to put your readers through reading a whole bunch of bickering and bullshit through the entire story or subplot. Having it so that every conflict in the relationship is some enormous nail in the coffin kind of crisis is just unrealistic and it's not very relatable, and that in turn makes it less compelling for the reader. One good way to make your readers believe that their characters have really come close and come to care about each other is having a character who may generally be scared of confrontation feel like they're comfortable enough around the other person to bring up issues they have or flaws, things they don't like about their significant other that they finally have the guts to tell them about. If every conflict in the relationship is a massive crisis, you can end up with a situation like Jim and Pam in The Office, where the only real crisis they ever had was that completely ridiculous, out of character kind of little arc where they were trying to make us believe that Pam might cheat on Jim with the audio guy. I think the reason they did that is because they realized there was never any conflict between Jim and Pam, and they just went way overboard, and naturally everyone hated it. You don't want to do that in your story. Have you ever read like a romantic subplot that kind of happens in its own bubble within the story, and like the relationship basically could have been taken out of the story and it would have had absolutely no impact on the main plot of the story? It frustrates me so much when that happens, because if you're going to the effort to include a romantic subplot in your story, do it for a reason. The relationship or the circumstances of the relationship has to have an impact on the main plot in some way, otherwise it's useless. Just as an example, maybe the newfound romance gives the hero more motivation, or maybe having this new person in their life that they care about gives them new perspective and shows them a different way to overcome this main obstacle they were stuck at in the main plot of the story. It doesn't just go for romance either, just don't bother including a subplot unless it has some kind of effect on the main plot. Otherwise it's just a waste of time. And I mean, it's especially true for romance because romantic subplots, like we said before, exist pretty much in every story. Man, the book community on Twitter, they really like debating romance in books. I've seen a lot of hot takes that I've agreed with, some I've disagreed with, more that I've happen to agree with, but basically what I'm talking about is the topic of writing about abusive relationships. I guess my take on abusive relationships, be that physical abuse or mental abuse in a relationship with a significant other, you absolutely can write about it. I think that's 100% fine. I really don't think there's any topic that should be shied away from when it comes to fiction writing. It's how it's approached in the story and the purpose of that topic in the story. So I think abusive relationships are okay to write about if they are treated as exactly that, abusive relationships. What becomes a problem is when an abusive relationship is romanticized. And I used to be pretty on the fence about it because I realized that being in an abusive relationship is actually technically a fetish. There are a lot of people that find it extremely arousing, I guess. But I do think it's a genuine and concerning problem when books that a younger audience, and I'm not talking about like full-blown erotica necessarily. So these books can find their way to a younger audience, and it just, yeah. Like, I was so conflicted about the Netflix show You, because like, at the end of the day, I think it's a fine show. I don't think there was anything necessarily wrong with it. I actually really enjoyed it. But there were so many examples of younger audience, people watching it and kind of defending the actions of the actual stalker, the character who was, for the sake of the story, an actual stalker. And although the show was told from the perspective of the story, I don't think it was framed in any way to try and deny the fact that he was a stalker, but yet you still had people like, I think it was Millie Bobby Brown, who was just straight up defending this guy and saying it wasn't stalking, it was love. It's just...
I know everybody's gonna say, oh, he's a stalker, why would you support that? No, like, he's in love with her, and it's just like, just watch the show and don't judge me on my opinion.
What I'm trying to say is that when abusive relationships in fiction start being less about the fetish, I guess, and more about just being some romanticized quirk, I think that's a problem. I don't think it's quirky. I don't think it's cute. I think it's just gross, honestly. I guess the last musing I would have on romance itself is the distinction between romance and erotica, because that line is being blurred a lot nowadays. Let's be real. If you want to read erotica, that's cool. You do you. Sex is pretty great. I get it. That's awesome. But don't go waving around a book that you know full well focuses entirely on a sexual plot rather than a romantic one, saying it's a romance book. Romantic books or romantic subplots can feature sex, obviously, and erotica stories can feature romance. That just happens. That's fine. If the catalyst for all of the problems in the story is something that will stop them from having sex or having sex the way they want to have sex, then it's probably an erotica story. If the catalyst for all of the issues is something that will stop them from getting together or staying together romantically, then it's a romance book or subplot. It seems like a weird peeve, I guess, and that's fine. Maybe I'm just being pedantic, but I would really rather those things stay separate. Anyway, that's really all I've got today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you liked the new format of these writing videos. I guess you can treat it as writing tips if you'd like. We've talked about a lot of stuff that would make writing a romance or a romantic subplot better or worse. But the whole point of the casual conversation format is that it's meant to be less objective, more subjective, just about stuff I've learned personally, stuff that I enjoy or dislike personally, and stuff that I feel, and perhaps a few things I feel are objective truths peppered throughout. So that's going to be the format for my writing mini-series going forward. If you have any genre you would like me to have a casual chat about, please let me know in the comments. Also, I'm sorry if this video wasn't as steamy as you thought it would be. I hope I haven't disappointed. But you know what? If it makes you feel better, I'll show you just a little bit of nipple. How about that, huh? You wanna see a little bit of just a little bit of nipple?